Now, TABOR, it stands for the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights.
Correct.
And it has thrown a wrench into how we tax marijuana in Colorado. It's also one of the most complex things we report on in this beat and probably in this newsroom. Very confusing, but you're good at putting things in an understandable way. So kind of tell us what TABOR's original intent is and why it's kind of screwed this up with marijuana.
With the TABOR amendment, voters said they're going to be the ones that make tax decisions. So when Amendment 64 said, legislature, figure out how to tax marijuana, we came up with a plan, but we had to put it on the ballot for voter approval because that's what TABOR says. Voters get to decide new taxes or tax increases. And clearly, Proposition AA was a new tax. We'd never imposed a special marijuana tax before.
Nope, hadn't done that.
There was no argument it was not a new tax that needed voter approval. So it went on the ballot. And part of that process is voters get a blue book mailed to their homes in usually late September, early October, before the election, that explains the ballot issues. TABOR requires any tax measure to have certain information included in the blue book. And it was. And one of the things was, how much is this tax? And the blue book estimated that the Prop AA taxes would generate $67 million in their first year. Now, in truth, we think we're going to be at about 63, maybe 64 million. We're coming in below the estimate. And so you might ask, why is there a problem if you didn't exceed the estimate? It wasn't the estimate of the tax revenue that was exceeded. TABOR also requires the blue book to tell you what is the total size of the state budget, all of the money that's subject to TABOR today, so that you can compare this new tax you're being asked to approve with, you know, the existing state budget. And in this case, it was a $67 million new tax and a $12.08 billion state budget that was subject to TABOR limits. And so that gave you some context, 67 million, 12 billion. You know, gave you some idea of how big of a tax increase is this. And obviously, voters said yes. You know, they weren't intimidated by the size, and maybe putting it in context is helpful. Well, it's that context, that $12 billion figure that was in the blue book, that turned out to be wrong. And it turned out to be wrong because it was produced in the summer of 2013, right as our economy was really heating up and the economic recovery was taking off.
Coming out of a recession.
And our economists just didn't project how quickly Colorado's economy would recover, or how we were faster than the rest of the country in adding new jobs and economic activity after the recession. And so they missed the estimate a little bit. The total state budget subject for TABOR for last year turned out to be $12.35 billion. We went over. It has nothing to do with the marijuana taxes. The marijuana taxes don't even count towards that number. Voters exempted them. And yet, because that number in the blue book was exceeded, the penalty under TABOR is refunding up to all of the tax revenue. And because it was exceeded by more than the amount of the tax revenue, we are being required to refund 100% of the taxes collected during the first full year of implementation. Now remember, sales started in January 2014, but the state uses a July to June fiscal year. So it's really the July 1, 2014 to June 30th, 2015, the period that just ended. That's the first year when this requirement of TABOR is in place, that you abide by the promises or the representations that were made to voters in the Blue Book. And it wasn't the pot taxes that came in too high, it was everything else. But here's the consequence.
And there was an amazing amount of misreporting on this subject. I believe we were one of the first media outlets to kind of come out and say, hey, this is happening, and there might be a refund, and the state might ask to keep this money. And then the way other outlets who aren't familiar with journalism or getting things right just said that Colorado made too much money from marijuana and has to give it back. And it's like, well, that's not what we said. And
that was the narrative folks were looking for. They were looking for the story that Colorado's just, you know, rolling in the dough because they legalized marijuana. And yes, you know, we're looking at $63 million in Prop AA revenue for that first year. But it's not because the sales exceeded the projections. Actually, we're all very surprised at how close our economists actually estimated that tax revenue, because they had nothing to go on. No one's ever created a legal marijuana market in their jurisdiction before. There was, you know, very little data and evidence for the economists to use to project that, and yet they've come in pretty accurate.
I'm a fan of the state economists. I've leaned on them a number of times to help explain a number of things to me, and they've been super helpful.